This is Dimitri Lascaris at COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco, on the penultimate day of the conference. And I'm here today with Adam Scott, Senior Campaigner in Canada for Oil Change International. Thank you for joining us.
No problem.
So I'd like to talk to you today about the subject of fossil fuel subsidies. And I'd like to begin our discussion with a proposition that I hope we can all agree is non-controversial and just sort of common sense. And that is, in a world where we're confronted by a global climate emergency, the last thing we should be doing is funneling public funds to the fossil fuels industry. And with sort of that common sense proposition underpinning our discussion, I'd like to just sort of overview with you what ultimately happened at COP21, if anything, in regard to this pressing question of fossil fuel subsidies. I did have the opportunity to interview your colleague Alex Dukas, but that was before the conclusion of the COP, so we never had a chance to talk about what, if anything, was done in the Paris Accord about this critical subject.
Yeah, there's not specific action outlined in the Paris Agreement on subsidies specifically, but the framework itself sets a pretty clear global direction for what needs to happen, and it's very clear to everybody that there's no room for any fossil fuel subsidies within the future, the near future, if we're going to actually meet the goals of the Paris Agreement. So that's the most significant thing to come out of Paris, is ultimately the goals of staying well below 2 degrees and striving for 1.5. That allows us to set all sorts of benchmarks in terms of where we need to go. So it's been clear and it's been acknowledged in many places that there's no room for fossil fuel subsidies. But unfortunately, what we have failed to see so far is another new, renewed commitment on the timeline, the exact timeline on how we're going to phase out the subsidies.
Well, let's talk about what has happened on the ground in terms of fossil fuel subsidies since the Paris Accord, taking into account that it really didn't specifically, not explicitly address the subject of fossil fuel subsidies. So globally speaking, has there been any progress made in terms of reducing fossil fuel subsidies?
Not substantially, no. What we were really looking for was, particularly through processes like the G20, to see an update, to see them say, okay, we're going to finally commit to a concrete timeline to phase out fossil fuel subsidies by 2020. And in the last meeting we just had, they failed to do that. The G20 originally promised to phase out fossil fuel subsidies back in 2009. We've seen no substantial action to date. So as we stand today, the most recent data we have shows there's nearly $1 trillion globally in production and consumption fossil fuel subsidies. Half of that is direct subsidies going to the fossil fuel industry, to coal, oil, and gas. Across countries, everybody's sort of given lip service to, yes, we should be phasing these out. They're inefficient. They make no sense. But we've seen no concrete moves towards that.
Just to play devil's advocate for a moment, one thing that we often hear is that within the last year to 2 years, the fossil fuels industry has suffered a lot of pain because of the crash in the oil price. And so governments, particularly those that have been sympathetic to the needs of the industry, in the past have used that as a justification for not taking action in the present. And what do you say to that argument?
Well, one thing that's really still missing from the larger conversation is an acknowledgement from many governments that what the goals of the Paris Agreement mean is a managed decline of the fossil fuel industry writ large. So, we actually have to admit what climate action entails before we start, moving down the road. And that means saying, look, the fossil fuel industry has to be smaller than it is today in the future, and it's going to have to eventually disappear from our lives. And so once you've admitted that, then it's much more difficult to justify providing incentives to grow the industry, which is exactly what we continue to do. And so now that governments are starting to put policies in place to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and Canada is one of those countries doing that, they're starting to roll out initiatives as part of their climate policy. Those are obviously coming into contradiction with the fact that they're still subsidizing fossil fuels. It's very challenging for them to be credible with any climate policy that doesn't start with eliminating incentives to continue to produce and to consume fossil fuels.
So let's talk about the case of Canada specifically. There was discussion about fossil fuel subsidies during the federal election campaign in Canada last year. If I recall correctly, some promises, or maybe not to the level of promises, but indications, positive indications were given by the Trudeau Liberals at that time about what they would do with fossil fuel subsidies. Could you tell us what in fact they promised, if anything, and what they in fact have done in relation to those subsidies since taking office late last year?
Yeah, when pressed, they have mentioned that yes, we see some issues with some subsidies in some places, and they talk about sort of efficient ones versus inefficient ones. It's a very complicated approach on their part. But one thing we've noticed from them is they haven't acknowledged the existence of a great deal of the subsidies that exist in Canada, and so they haven't admitted the scale or scope of the problem that we have. We put a report out just this week here at COP calling out Canada for its ongoing fossil fuel subsidies to the tune of $3.3 billion a year in production and consumption subsidies.
Is that strictly federal, or is that all levels of government?
That's all wrapped in. There are other layers to that. That certainly doesn't capture all of them, but that's sort of the high level. And what you get from that is essentially it's the equivalent to a $19 a ton carbon price, or negative carbon price. So the government's recently announced they're going to be putting a carbon tax in place.
You're talking about the federal government?
The government of Canada is going to put a carbon tax in place, which is designed to increase the cost of fossil fuels. But at the same time, roughly speaking, the subsidies they have actually undermine that directly. And so what we've seen is that the subsidies will actually be higher than the carbon price up until 2020, which is working directly against their own policy initiative.
If I recall correctly, the carbon price they want to set initially, with respect to jurisdictions that don't already have one, is $10.
That's right. And it will rise over time, but won't rise substantially enough to have the impact that it needs to have, and its impact will be even less if they continue to subsidize the industry the way they have. So this is, fossil fuel subsidies are, as an issue, are the sort of thing, the very first and critical thing you need to do if you're serious about moving down a path to tackle climate change.
Now, here at COP22, what, if anything, has been done to address this pressing issue?
Yeah, well, the Secretary General of the United Nations made a statement the other day saying it's absolutely critical. This is one of the first things we have to do. We must eliminate subsidies. But we haven't seen much recognition otherwise from governments here at the meetings, and there's been no substantive inclusion of any discussion on phasing out subsidies within any of the negotiations themselves. So that's a bit frustrating to see that this is still not an issue that's got concrete traction. Many governments have made statements about phasing out subsidies, and as I was saying, the G20 promised back in 2009 to do so. What we're looking for now is the concrete phase-out plan, the detailed, by this year we will have zero from governments, and we haven't seen that yet. So we need to see it in Canada, and we need to see it at the international level as well.
What do you think accounts for the intractability of this problem? Why is it that we can't get governments, when confronted by a global climate emergency, to at least begin to ratchet down the fossil fuel subsidies? What accounts for all of this?
It's the influence of the fossil fuel industry itself with money to governments.
So basically, to a degree, they're using our own money to perpetuate a scheme that results in our money flowing to the fossil fuels.
There's a great deal of influence and money flowing from fossil fuel companies to governments, specifically to look out for their own interests. And that's the great tension at all of these international negotiations is how do we get the fossil fuel companies out of the conversation? They can't be part of a clean energy future. They can't be part of what we need to do. And at some point we need to say, you're not invited into the room while we discuss what's going to happen. And this starts with a very basic policy to phase out incentives for them to get special treatment. We're struggling to get renewable energy, electric vehicles, all of these important steps that we need to make the energy transition going forward happen. And these subsidies are working against that.
Well, thank you very much for joining us here at COP22, and I hope I'll have a chance to talk to you some more in the future about our progress, if any, in terms of battling against fossil fuel subsidies.
Great to see you.
This is Dimitri Lascaris for The Real News, COP22 in Marrakesh, Morocco.